You know, I've spent decades sitting across from people who are at the absolute end of their rope. And if there is one thing I have learned, it is that the truth doesn't have versions. It only has perspectives. And usually those perspectives are clouded by a whole lot of pain, ego, and fear. When I first looked at the file for this case, I saw a familiar pattern emerging before I even walked out onto that stage. We're talking about a young woman named Kayla, 28 years old, bright, educated, and by all accounts, the golden child of her family for nearly 3 decades. But now, her parents and her older brother are convinced she has completely lost her mind. They say she's being manipulated, that she's discarded her common sense, and that she is currently spiraling into a relationship that will eventually destroy everything she's worked for. On the other side, you have Kayla, who sits there with this defiant tilt to her chin, telling me that for the first time in her life, she is actually awake. She claims her family doesn't want her happy. They want her controlled. It's a classic setup, but as I always say, you can't fix what you don't acknowledge. My job in these moments isn't just to play referee in a family shouting match. My job is to peel back the layers of the onion until we find the core of the dysfunction. Because believe me, there is always a core. Usually, it's a wound that's been festering for years, and this new relationship is just the salt that finally made the sting unbearable. I'm looking at these people in the green room before we start watching them on the monitors, and the energy is toxic. You could cut the tension with a knife. The mother, Diane, is clutching her purse like it's a life preserver, her knuckles white, her face a mask of practiced tragedy. The father, Robert, is staring at the floor, radiating a quiet, simmering anger. And then there's the brother, Marcus, who's pacing like a caged tiger, convinced he's the only one who sees the truth about Kayla's new boyfriend, a man named Jax. When I walked out and took my seat, I didn't start with the accusations. I started with the psychology. I wanted to know who Kayla was before Jax entered the picture. You see, people don't just go off the rails for no reason. There is always a trajectory. Kayla grew up in a household where performance was the currency of love. She was the straight-A student, the star athlete, the daughter who never gave them a moment's trouble. She lived her life according to a script written by her parents. She went to the right schools, took the right job in corporate finance, and dated the right kind of guys, men who were essentially clones of her father. But here's the thing about scripts. Eventually, the actor gets tired of the role. If you spend 28 years being who everyone else wants you to be, you're eventually going to have an identity crisis that hits you like a freight train. Enter Jax. From a psychological standpoint, Jax is what we call a rebound from reality. He is everything her family is not. He's a guy with tattoos, a checkered past, a history of run-ins with the law, and a complete lack of interest in the corporate ladder. To Diane and Robert, he is a predator who has identified a vulnerable, sheltered girl and is currently grooming her for his own gain. To Kayla, he represents freedom. He represents a life where she doesn't have to be perfect. The problem is, when you run away from something, you rarely look at where you're running to. You're just focused on the escape. I looked at Kayla as she sat there on the stage, and I could see the exhaustion behind her eyes, even though she was trying so hard to look tough. I asked her a simple question. Kayla, what is it about this man that makes him worth losing your entire support system? She didn't hesitate. She told me that Jax sees the real her. She said that her parents only love the version of her that makes them look good at the country club. That's a heavy statement, and it's one that Diane immediately tried to shut down. Diane started crying those theatrical, gasping sobs that are designed to shift the focus from the issue to the emotion, and shouted about how they've sacrificed everything for Kayla. but I wasn't buying the performance. I turned to Diane and told her to take a breath because we weren't there to talk about her sacrifices. We were there to talk about the current reality. The reality, as I saw it, was a massive power struggle. This wasn't just about a bad boyfriend. This was about a family that had never allowed one of its members to have an autonomous thought. When the perfect child finally pushes back, the family doesn't see it as growth. They see it as a malfunction. They start using labels like brainwashed or out of control because it's easier than admitting their own dynamic might be stifling. However, I couldn't let Kayla off the hook either. Just because your parents are overbearing doesn't mean your choices are healthy. Jax had a history that would make any sane parent nervous. We're talking about multiple arrests for domestic disturbance and a track record of financial instability. If you're a parent and you see your daughter moving in with a guy like that after 3 weeks, you're going to react. The question is the reaction making the problem better or worse? I began to dig into the backstory of how this escalation began. It didn't start with the move-in. It started months ago with small lies. Kayla began hiding her whereabouts. She started missing family dinners. When she finally introduced Jax, it was an ambush. She brought him to her brother's wedding, of all places, knowing full well it would cause a scene. Why do that? Why choose the most public, sensitive family moment to debut a man you know they will hate? It's because she wanted the explosion. She wanted to force their hand so she would have a valid reason to cut them off. It's what I call engineering a crisis. If she can make them the villains, then she can justify her own radical behavior. As I analyzed the patterns, I saw that Marcus, the brother, had taken on the role of the enforcer. He had actually gone as far as to hire a private investigator to dig up dirt on Jax. He presented Kayla with a folder full of Jax's past mistakes, thinking that logic and facts would wake her up. But that's not how the human brain works when it's under the influence of a high-intensity infatuation. When you attack a person's partner, you aren't attacking the partner, you're attacking the person's judgment. You're telling them you are too stupid to know who is good for you. That only makes them dig their heels in deeper. Kayla didn't look at the folder and say, "Oh, thank you, Marcus, for saving me." She looked at it and saw a betrayal of her privacy. She saw a brother who didn't respect her as an adult. The escalation was palpable as we sat there. Every time Robert tried to speak, he would get halfway through a sentence before his voice would crack with rage, calling Jax a bottom feeder and a loser. And every time he did that, I watched Kayla move physically further away from him on the sofa. She was literally leaning toward the exit. I told Robert, every time you call that man a name, you are driving another nail into the coffin of your relationship with your daughter. You think you're fighting him, but you're actually fighting her. It's a hard pill to swallow for a father who thinks he's protecting his little girl, but she isn't a little girl. She's a grown woman making grown woman mistakes, and the more they tried to treat her like a child, the more she was going to act out like a teenager. I wanted to get to the why behind Jax. Not just why she liked him, but why she needed him right now. There is a psychological concept called counterdependence. It's when you are so afraid of being controlled that you move to the opposite extreme. You don't make choices based on what you actually want. You make choices based on what is the exact opposite of what your controllers want. If her parents wanted her to marry a doctor, she was going to find a guy who couldn't hold down a job at a car wash. It's not about the guy. It's about the rebellion. And that's a dangerous way to live because you're still not free. You're still being defined by your parents, just in reverse. I leaned back in my chair and looked at Diane. She was shaking her head, tears still shimmering in her eyes, but there was a hardness there too. I've seen that look 1,000 times. It's the look of a mother who feels she has been robbed of her investment. And I don't use that word investment lightly. In families like this, Children are often treated as assets. You pour in the private lessons, the tuition, the right clothes, and the social etiquette, and you expect a certain return on that capital. When the child starts making bad choices, the parents feel like their bank account has been emptied by a thief. I told Diane, "You're acting like she's a car you bought that suddenly won't start." But she's not an object, Diane. She's a woman who is trying to find where she ends and you begin. We started talking about the months leading up to the Jax era. It became clear that Kayla hadn't just snapped overnight. She had been quiet, quitting her own life for nearly 2 years. She told me about the nights she would sit in her car in the parking lot of her high-rise office building, crying for 20 minutes before she could find the strength to go upstairs and deal with the spreadsheets and the corporate politics. She felt like a fraud. She was living a life that looked great on Instagram, but felt like a prison cell on the inside. Her parents, meanwhile, were oblivious. As long as she was getting the promotions and showing up for Sunday brunch in a sundress, they thought everything was fine. They didn't see the woman who was drowning. They only saw the woman who was staying afloat. Then came the night of the great blow-up, as they called it. It was 6 months ago. The family was gathered for Robert's 60th birthday. It was a formal affair, black tie, very prestigious. Kayla arrived late, and she wasn't alone. She brought Jax. Now, keep in mind, this was the first time they had ever laid eyes on him. He showed up in jeans and a leather jacket, looking like he'd just stepped off a construction site, which, to be fair, he had. But it wasn't just the clothes, it was the energy. He was loud, he was irreverent, and he made no effort to fit in. He spent the evening talking about his philosophy of life, which mostly involved complaining about the government and the sheep who work 9-to-5 jobs. I asked Robert what he felt in that moment. He didn't say he was angry, he said he was embarrassed. And that right there is a key piece of the puzzle. When a parent's primary emotion is embarrassment, it tells me that their focus is outward on the neighbors and the peers rather than inward on their child's well-being. Robert went into the kitchen and told Kayla she had to ask Jax to leave. Kayla refused. She told her father that if Jax wasn't welcome, she wasn't welcome. She walked out of that party, and she hasn't set foot in her parents' house since. Since that night, the escalation has been nuclear. The family has tried everything. They tried the carrot offering to pay off her student loans if she would just go to counseling, which was really just their way of saying get deprogrammed. When that didn't work, they tried the stick. Robert, who had been helping Kayla with the lease on her apartment, pulled his financial support. He thought that if she was broke, she'd come crawling back. But he underestimated the power of spite. Spite is a powerful fuel. Kayla didn't come crawling back. She moved into Jax's one-bedroom apartment in a part of town her mother wouldn't even drive through during the day. I turned my attention to Marcus. Marcus is the older brother who followed the plan perfectly. He's a lawyer, married with 2 kids, the perfect son who stayed the course. But Marcus was harboring a lot of resentment. He felt like he was the one doing all the heavy lifting to keep the family together while Kayla was off playing rebel without a cause. He told me, "Dr. Phil, I've spent my whole life being the responsible one. And now I'm the one who has to pick up the pieces of my parents' broken hearts while she's out there living some fantasy with a guy who's going to end up in jail by Christmas." I looked at Marcus and I said, "You're not mad at her for being with Jax. You're mad at her for having the nerve to walk away from the expectations that you're still slaves to." That hit a nerve. You could see the air leave the room. I've seen this sibling dynamic before. The good child resents the bad child, not because the behavior is bad, but because the bad child has claimed a freedom that the good child doesn't feel allowed to have. Marcus was jealous of her chaos because it was honest. His life was structured, but it was also a heavy burden. We had to address the elephant in the room, Jax himself. I had my team do some digging, and let's just say the background check wasn't pretty. I pulled out the records. Jax had a history of what I call parasitic lifestyle choices. He had a pattern of finding women who were in transition or in crisis, moving in quickly, and then living off them until the money ran out or the drama became too much. He had 3 different restraining orders from 3 different women in 3 different counties. This wasn't just a bad boy with a heart of gold. This was a man with a documented pattern of predatory behavior. I laid these documents out on the table in front of Kayla. I didn't yell, I didn't lecture, I just put the facts in front of her. Kayla, I said, I'm not your father. I don't care about your reputation. I don't care about the country club. I care about your safety. Look at these names. Look at these dates. Are all 3 of these women crazy? Are all 3 of them liars coached by their families to hate him? Because that's the story he's told you, isn't it? Kayla's face changed. The defiance didn't disappear, but it flickered. She looked at the papers, and I could see her brain trying to find a way to rationalize it. She started talking about how he had told her about his past, how he was a changed man, and how those women had pushed him to the limit. That's the classic language of an enabler. She was already making excuses for a man who hadn't even earned her trust yet. I asked her, what is the payoff for you here? Because there is always a payoff. You are a smart woman, you're an analyst, you know how to look at data. If you saw a company with this kind of track record, you'd never invest a dime of your client's money in it. So why are you investing your life in it? She stayed quiet for a long time. Then she said something that really struck me. She said, because when I'm with him, I'm the only one who matters. My parents want me to be a success. Marcus wants me to be stable. Jax just wants me, and there it was. The core of the issue, she was so starved for unconditional acceptance, for someone to love her for her essence rather than her achievements, that she was willing to overlook the fact that the person loving her was a dangerous con artist. She had traded the golden cage of her parents' expectations for the invisible cage of a manipulator's charm. I looked at Diane and Robert. Do you hear what she's saying? She's saying that she felt like a project to you. She felt like a trophy. If you want her back, you have to stop trying to fix her and start trying to know her. But you, I turn back to Kayla, you're choosing a path that leads to a cliff. You think you're being brave by standing up to them, but you're actually just being reckless with your own soul. You aren't proving your independence, you're proving your vulnerability. We were getting into the escalation phase of the conversation now. The emotions were high, the secrets were out, and the battle lines were drawn. The question was, could we find a way to bridge the gap before the whole thing went up in flames? I knew that the next hour was going to be the most critical of her life and, quite frankly, the most critical for this family's future. Because once you see the truth, you can't unsee it. You can only choose to ignore it or act on it. The moment I laid out that file with Jax's history, I saw Robert lean forward, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. He was ready to pounce. He looked at Kayla and said, see, we told you. We told you he was a criminal. That right there is the biggest mistake a parent can make in this situation. I had to stop him mid-sentence. I told him, Robert, if you use this information as a told you so club to beat her over the head with, you've already lost. You're not looking for the truth, you're looking for a victory. And if you win this argument, you lose your daughter. It was a cold bucket of water over his head, but he needed it. He was so focused on being right that he was completely missing the look of sheer terror that was beginning to creep into Kayla's eyes. You see, Kayla wasn't just defending Jax anymore, she was defending her own ego. When you've blown up your entire life, quit your job, moved into a dive apartment, and alienated every person who ever loved you. The stakes are so high that you almost can't afford to be wrong. If Jax is a predator, then Kayla isn't a rebel, she's a victim. And if she's a victim, then she has to face the fact that she's been a fool. For a woman who was raised to be the smartest person in every room, that is a fate worse than death. She would rather go down with the ship than admit she shouldn't have been the captain of it in the first place. I turned back to Kayla and I changed my tone. I moved from the clinical to the personal. I asked her about the isolation. Kayla, tell me the truth. How many of your friends from the office still call you? How many of your girlfriends from college have you seen in the last 3 months? She looked away, her fingers nervously twisting a strand of hair. She admitted that she drifted away from them because they didn't understand her new lifestyle. But we both knew what that meant. In the psychology of domestic manipulation, the first step is always isolation. You cut the person off from anyone who can provide a reality check. You become their only source of information, their only source of validation. She told me about a night, just 2 weeks prior, when she had planned to go to dinner with a former colleague. Jax had made a comment about how that colleague probably looked down on her now. He'd started a fight over nothing, something about her choice of outfit, and by the time the argument was over, she was too exhausted and upset to go. She stayed home and they made up. That is the cycle. Create a crisis, isolate the target, then provide the only available comfort. It's a textbook play. And she was falling for it, hook, line, and sinker. I asked her, "Does he have a job yet, Kayla?" She stammered. She said he was consulting. He was between projects. He was waiting for a settlement from a previous injury. I've heard every version of that lie. I looked at the financial records her father had provided. Kayla's savings account, which had been substantial, was nearly gone. She was paying the rent. She was paying for the groceries. She was even paying for the gas in his truck. I asked her, "If you lost your last dollar tomorrow, do you honestly believe he'd be standing there by your side? Or would he be looking for the next golden child with a bank account?" That was the confrontation phase. That was the moment the tension in the room hit its peak. Diane started crying again, but this time it wasn't the performative sobbing from earlier. It was real, quiet, gut-wrenching grief. She realized that her daughter wasn't just out of control, she was being consumed. Marcus was vibrating with a mixture of anger and pity. And Kayla looked like she was about to shatter into a million pieces. She started to fight back, but not against the facts. She started attacking the family dynamic again. She brought up a story from when she was 12. She had finished second in a regional piano competition. She remembered coming off stage, heart pounding, and the first thing her father said to her was, "The girl who won had better posture than you." She looked at Robert and said, "You never loved me. You loved my posture. You loved my grades. Jax loves me when I'm a mess. He loves me when I'm crying in the middle of the floor." I let that hang in the air for a second because it was a powerful truth. I told Robert and Diane, you have to own that. You created a vacuum in this girl's soul where she felt that her only value was in her performance. You taught her that love is conditional. And when someone like Jax comes along and offers what feels like unconditional love, even if it's a lie, she's going to grab it like a drowning person grabs a life raft. But then I turned the mirror back on Kayla. However, I said, using your parents' past mistakes to justify your present self-destruction is a cop-out. You're 28 years old. At some point, you have to stop being a reaction to your parents and start being a person of your own. You are using Jax to punish your father. You're saying, "Look, Dad, I'm with the one guy you can't control, and I'm letting him ruin me. just to show you that you can't stop it. But who is really getting punished here? Robert is still living in his big house. Diane is still going to her clubs. You're the one living in a dump with a man who has a history of hitting women. The word hitting hit her like a physical blow. She tried to deny it. She said Jax would never hurt her. I pointed to the restraining orders again. These women all said the same thing, Kayla. They all thought they were the special one who could change him. They all thought his anger was just passion until it was directed at them. You are not the exception to the rule. You are the next chapter in his book. We sat in silence for a long time. The show part of the afternoon had faded away, and it was just 4 people in a room facing a very ugly reality. I could see the gears turning in Kayla's head. She was at a crossroads. One path led back to the golden cage, the safety, the money, but also the stifling expectations of her family. The other path led to a potential disaster with a man who was clearly using her. I told her, there is a third path, Kayla. You don't have to go back to being their puppet, but you can't stay where you are. You need to walk away from both of these toxic situations. You need to find out who you are when nobody is watching and nobody is wanting anything from you. But you can't do that as long as you're living in a war zone. I looked at the family. Are you willing to give her the space to do that? Without the judgment, without the I told you so's, are you willing to support her in finding herself, even if the person she finds isn't the one you planned for? Robert looked at Diane, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of humility in him. He nodded. Marcus reached out and put a hand on his sister's arm. For a second, she didn't pull away. But the breakthrough isn't always a movie ending. Real life is messier. Just as I thought we were making progress, Kayla's phone buzzed. It was a text from Jax. I saw her face change the moment she read it. The walls went right back up. The fear replaced the vulnerability. He was checking in. He was marking his territory. He was pulling the leash. I knew right then that we weren't going to fix this in one afternoon. This was going to be a long, painful process of deconstruction. Kayla looked at me, and her voice was cold again. He's waiting for me in the car, she said. He says, we need to leave. I didn't try to stop her. You can't force someone to be free if they're still in love with their chains. I just looked her in the eye and said, we have a team ready to help you. We have a place for you to go where he can't find you. We have the resources to get you back on your feet. The door is open, Kayla, but you're the only one who can walk through it. If you walk out that door and get into that car, you are choosing a path that I cannot follow you down. She stood up. It was a slow, deliberate movement, like she was bracing herself against a heavy wind. That phone in her hand might as well have been a remote control, and Jax was the one pressing the buttons. I've seen this happen more times than I care to count the invisible tether. You can have a breakthrough, you can see the logic, you can even feel the stirrings of self-preservation, but the moment the manipulator reaches out, the programming kicks back in. It's a form of emotional muscle memory. She wasn't thinking with her prefrontal cortex anymore. She was reacting from her amygdala, the part of the brain that handles fear and survival. Diane jumped up, reaching out for her daughter's hand, but Kayla flinched away. That flinch was the loudest thing in the room. It told the whole story of their relationship. To Kayla, her mother's touch wasn't a comfort, it was a grab. It was an attempt to pull her back into a life she had come to associate with performance and pressure. Robert stayed in his seat, his face a mask of stone, but I could see his jaw working. He was vibrating with the effort of not shouting. I told them both to stay back. I told them that if they chased her down the hallway, they were just proving Jax's point. He'd told her they were the enemy, and if they acted like a pair of frantic jailers, they were just validating his lie. Kayla, I said, my voice low and steady, I didn't want to add to the noise in her head. I want you to look at me just for 10 seconds. She paused, her hand already on the strap of her bag. She looked at me, and I saw a woman who was absolutely terrified of being wrong. I told her, "You're going to get in that car, and he's going to ask you what we talked about. He's going to tell you that I'm a media personality who doesn't know him. He's going to tell you your parents paid me to say those things. And then he's going to start a fight with you about why you stayed here so long, just to make sure you're sufficiently punished for listening to anyone but him. You know that's coming. You can feel it in your gut right now." She didn't say a word. She just turned and walked off the stage. The studio was silent. Usually, there's a murmur from the audience, but this time, it was like everyone was holding their breath. We watched her on the monitors as she walked through the backstage area, through the heavy soundproof doors, and out into the bright California sun where Jax was waiting in a rusted-out black SUV. He didn't get out of the car to greet her. He didn't offer a hug. He just leaned over and opened the passenger door from the inside. She got in, and they peeled out of the lot before the door was even fully shut. Inside the studio, the family was falling apart. Robert finally let out a roar of frustration, slamming his fist into the palm of his hand. Diane was back to the gasping sobs. Marcus just stared at the exit sign. I let him sit in it for a minute. You have to let the reality of the situation sink in. You can't rush the grieving process. And that's exactly what this was. They were grieving the daughter they thought they had. I sat back down with them. "Listen to me," I said. "This is a dark day, but it's an honest day. For the first time in 28 years, the masks are off. You now know exactly where you stand. You are in a battle for her soul, but you cannot win that battle with a frontal assault. You've been trying to outmuscle a professional manipulator, and you're losing because you're playing by the rules of logic while he's playing by the rules of addiction." I explained to them the concept of intermittent reinforcement. It's the most powerful psychological hook there is. It's why people play slot machines. If a machine never pays out, you stop playing. If it pays out every time, it becomes boring. But if it pays out just often enough to keep you hoping, you'll stay there until you're broke. Jax was doing that to Kayla. He'd treat her like garbage for 3 days, and then on the 4th day, he'd be the most charming, attentive, soulmate-level partner she'd ever imagined. He'd tell her she was the only one who truly understood him. That hit of validation was so high that she was willing to endure the 3 days of hell just to get back to it. You guys have been providing constant reinforcement, I told the parents. You've provided the money, the safety, the expectations. It's predictable, it's boring, and to her, it feels like a burden. Jax provides the chaos, and in that chaos, she feels alive. It's a sick dynamic, but it's a real one. I told Robert and Diane that they had to go dark. This is the hardest piece of advice I ever have to give a parent. I told them they had to stop calling her, stop texting her, stop offering to pay for things. No more check-ins, no more emergency bailouts, because as long as they were providing a safety net, Kayla felt she could afford to take risks with Jax. She knew deep down that if it all went to hell, Daddy would write a check. I told them they had to take that off the table. She had to feel the full weight of her choices. She had to feel the cold, hard floor of her own life. "But what if he hurts her?" Diane whispered. Her face was pale, and she looked 10 years older than when she walked in. "That is a risk," I said, and I didn't sugarcoat it. "But he's already hurting her. He's destroying her mind, her career, and her future. If you keep subsidizing this relationship, you are essentially paying for her destruction. You have to make it so that the only way she can find air is to come back to reality, not to your house, not to your rules, but to her own life. I turn to Marcus and you. You need to stop being the good son for a while and just be a brother. When she finally does call, and she will, when the money runs out or the first time he puts a hand on her, you don't lecture her. You don't say, I told you so. You just say, I love you, and I'm here when you're ready to leave. That's it. No conditions, no buts. She needs to know there's a landing strip where the lights are always on. The weeks following that show were quiet. My team kept in touch with the family, but for a long time, there was nothing but radio silence from Kayla. She had changed her phone number. She had deleted her social media accounts. Jax had successfully completed the blackout phase of his plan. He had her all to himself. But here's the thing about guys like Jax. They are their own worst enemies. They can't help but overplay their hand. They get greedy. They get arrogant. They think they've won. So they stop trying to be the soulmate and start being the dictator full time. And that's when the intermittent reinforcement stops working. When the payouts stop coming, even the most addicted gambler eventually realizes the machine is broken. About 3 months after the recording, we got a call from Marcus. He sounded shaken. He told us that Kayla had shown up at his office at 6 p.m. on a Tuesday. She didn't have a car. She didn't have her purse. She was wearing a coat that wasn't hers, and she had a split lip. Jax had finally snapped. He'd accused her of looking at another man at the grocery store, and when she tried to walk away, he showed her exactly who he was. The breakthrough didn't happen on my stage. It happened in that grocery store parking lot. It happened when the reality of the restraining orders in that file became her own reality. She had spent months trying to prove her family wrong, but in that moment, the pain was greater than the pride. She didn't go to her parents' house, she went to Marcus. She knew Marcus was the one who wouldn't judge her as harshly. She knew Marcus was her bridge back to the world. Marcus didn't take her to their parents' house. He knew better. He took her to a safe house that my team had arranged weeks prior, a place where the location was unlisted and the security was airtight. He called me from the car, his voice thick with a mixture of relief and pure, unadulterated terror. He told me, "She's here, Dr. Phil. She's finally here." I told him to stay calm and not to ask her a single question about Jax, not one. I told him his only job was to get her through those doors and let the professionals take over. Because at that moment, Kayla wasn't a daughter or a sister. She was a survivor of a psychological war zone, and her flight or fight response was still pinned at a 10. When I spoke to Robert and Diane the next morning, I had to be very firm. They wanted to rush to the safe house. They wanted to bring her clothes, her favorite childhood blanket, and a list of doctors they'd already researched. They were ready to fix her with the same intensity that had driven her away in the first place. I had to stop them. I told them, if you walk in there right now with your solutions and your I told you so's hidden behind a smile, you will break the very fragile trust she has just managed to find. You have to let her come to you. You have to let her sit in the silence of her own life for a while. It was a hard pill for them to swallow. Robert, especially, struggled with the idea that he couldn't control the recovery process. But I reminded him that his control was what Jax had used as a weapon against her. Jax had told her that her parents didn't love her, they only loved the idea of her. If Robert walked in and started barking orders, he was just making Jax a prophet. We spent the next several days working with the parents on how to listen. Not just hear, but listen. We worked on validation without agreement. They didn't have to agree with her past choices, but they had to validate her present pain. Kayla stayed in that facility for 30 days. It wasn't a rehab for drugs or alcohol, it was a rehab for the soul. She worked with trauma specialists who helped her understand the grooming process she'd undergone. She had to face the ugly truth that she had been a willing participant in her own destruction because she was so desperate to hurt her parents. That is a heavy realization for a 28-year-old woman to carry. She had to grieve the time she'd lost, the money she'd spent, and the dignity she felt she'd traded away. I went to see her toward the end of her stay. She looked different. The hard, defiant edge was gone, replaced by a sort of quiet, weary wisdom. She wasn't the golden child anymore, but she wasn't the rebel either. She was just Kayla. We sat in the garden of the facility, and she told me, "I thought I was being so strong, Dr. Phil. I thought I was the only one who saw the truth, but I was just a different kind of puppet. I went from being my father's puppet to being Jax's puppet, and I never once stopped to ask who I actually was. I told her that was the most honest thing I'd heard her say. I told her that the golden child role was a mask, and the rebel role was just the same mask turned inside out. To find herself, she had to stop performing for an audience. She had to learn to be okay with being unsatisfactory to everyone else as long as she was authentic to herself. The reunion with her parents happened on neutral ground in a therapist's office. There were no cameras, no studio lights, just 4 people and a lot of raw emotion. It wasn't a happily ever after moment. There were still tears, there was still some residual anger, and there was a lot of awkwardness. But for the first time in years, there was honesty. Robert didn't lecture. Diane didn't perform. They just sat there and told her they were glad she was alive. And Kayla? Kayla didn't apologize for being bad. She apologized for being absent. She told them she wasn't ready to move back home, and she wasn't ready to take the high-powered finance job back. She was going to work at a local nonprofit and live in a small apartment by herself. Robert started to protest, started to say she was overqualified, but he caught himself. He looked at me, then back at his daughter, and he just nodded. He said, "If that's what you need, then that's what we'll support." It was a small victory, but in a family dynamic this entrenched, a small victory is a mountain. As for Jax, he didn't go away quietly. He tried the texts, the emails, even showing up at Marcus's office once more. But this time the family was a united front. They didn't engage, they didn't argue, they just handed the evidence over to the authorities. Without a target to manipulate, Jax eventually did what parasites always do. He went looking for a new host. It's a sad reality, but people like that rarely change. They just change locations. I look back at this case and I see it as a cautionary tale for every family out there. We think we're doing our kids a favor by demanding excellence, by pushing them toward a certain vision of success. But if we don't leave room for them to fail, if we don't leave room for them to be messy and imperfect, they will find that room in the most dangerous places. Kayla had to go to the brink of a cliff to find the strength to stand on her own 2 feet. The last time I heard from her, she sent me a short note. She told me she had spent the weekend alone, just reading a book and drinking coffee. She said it was the most boring weekend of her life, and she loved every second of it. That's when I knew she was going to be okay. Because when you no longer need the high of the drama or the high of the praise, you've finally found peace. She isn't the woman her parents planned for, and she isn't the woman Jax tried to create. She's just Kayla, and that is more than enough. We talk about getting your life back, but the truth is, you can't get your old life back. You can only build a new one. Kayla is building hers one boring, peaceful day at a time. And her parents, they're learning that a daughter who is out of control might just be a woman who is finally taking the wheel. It's a long road ahead, but they're finally driving in the right direction.